Hello, friends. Chris Corsi here, president of Thrive Today, and I want to welcome you to the Relational Skills in Real Life podcast. Friends, I'm glad you're here. Today's topic is on your lens to see God. That's right. How do you view God? And we're going to explore how past relationships and previous experiences impact the way that we understand, the way that we approach, the way that we relate with God. So we're going to think a little bit about today what creates the lens for how you understand God, what you expect from God, how you perceive God, how you interpret God's mind through His Word. And in this episode, I'm going to really explore how those past relationships and with people and interactions can really set the tone for how we understand and view God. Friends, this feels like a very relevant topic as a lot of us see God through the lens of our own brokenness, the lens of our own struggles, our own weaknesses, our own hard times. And so reflect on how you view God for a moment. How do you see God when you think about him? You could even close your eyes if you like, if you're not driving. How do you see God? Is Jesus a tender, loving shepherd who has your best interest in mind? Is Jesus an available resource to help you live your life very practically? Does it feel like your needs are important to God? Do you believe that God is motivated to care for you, to meet those needs that you have, to comfort you, and to guide you in such a way that your life matters, that you have an impact in God's kingdom, a role in God's kingdom and God's economy? Do you feel important to God? Do you feel cared for and loved by God? Does God feel like a resource when things are hard, when you're upset, when you're struggling, when you're hurting? Does God feel like a resource you can turn to for help, for support, for encouragement? Well, friends, these are important questions to consider because there are lots of good reasons why we see God the way that we do. And a lot of things in this world can influence our perception of God. And that's what I want to explore a little bit today. It might feel like a stretch for you to feel like and believe that God cares for you and that God wants what is best for you. Possibly you feel like you must meet your own needs in some way, or you have to live life in such a way that you look out for yourself and your own needs and your own well-being because no one else is going to care for you or look out for you or protect you. You see, today's topic is really about looking at the factors and those ingredients that have gone into cultivating how we view God and how we approach and understand God, and even how we look at His Word and understand His character and His mind. Even how we believe God sees us is impacted by the lens that we have grown through interactions, through experiences that might not always be pleasant and good experiences. So the reality is, if you live on this planet, this podcast is for you because I believe we all have factors that go into how we view God. And this really hits home for me because I grew up believing that God was real and all powerful. I knew that God existed. I had no doubt in my mind. But I had some distortions about God. I definitely didn't feel like God was glad to be with me. I often felt like God was too busy for me. He had other more important, pressing things to do. There's a lot of needs in this world. So why would I expect God to really care for and meet my needs? So I also believe that God was often angry or disappointed in me because I was not doing all the right things or living in such a way that He wanted me to live. So I knew enough about God by reading His Word that there were certain expectations of how He wanted His children to live. And I kind of felt like my needs just weren't important to God and that He would be upset with me if I had a fear, if I had a struggle, if I did something wrong. So, to be honest with you, I felt like God was just an angry teacher who's having a bad day all the time. And this teacher is just waiting for me to mess up so he could slap me on the hand and give me a bad grade on my report card. So I just kind of intuitively felt that God was going to say, Chris, you're a bad student. You're a bad person. And I'm mad at you because you're not doing all the right things that you're supposed to be doing. As you can imagine, I didn't exactly want to get close to this God because I feared his reaction and I feared that these things were true. And that really created some obstacles and hindrances in my relationship with God. That might not be a surprise for you that a lot of my perceptions came from important family relationships and experiences where I maybe felt punished in some ways, misunderstood, even forgotten in some ways. So as I look back on my life, I could see that some of my experiences in life and my interactions with people were heavily influenced my lens for how I viewed God. I was putting him into the role of how I viewed authority figures and how I viewed um, unhelpful experiences or painful experiences in my life. So I was pleasantly surprised to discover that Jesus was not only with me, he was glad to be with me. When I started to interact with God and started to really discover that Jesus is truly with me, I was shocked, frankly, that he was tender. He was caring. He was compassionate. He was kind. He was loving. And he actually had my best interest in mind. And that he wasn't neglecting me. He wasn't yelling at me. He wasn't forgetting me. So the breakdown here wasn't on God's part. The breakdown was on my part. Something was off in my understanding of God because I was not seeing him as he is. I was seeing him through my distorted lens, my broken lens, my sins, my pain, my struggles, my fears. Friends, pain is loud, and pain demands your brain's attention. And so there's some factors that tend to influence how we view God. Family and attachment relationships are key, whether we like it or not. Important relationships, people that we are bonded to, have a lot of influence in our mind and our view of God. Negative experiences, negative influences can also interrupt how well we view God because negative experiences really leave a mark. If our brain doesn't return to joy and peace from upsets, then we get stuck in things that are loud or upsetting, right? And that leads to coping strategies and coping mechanisms that really aren't good for us. So negative experiences leave a mark. And how we view and make sense out of those experiences ultimately goes on God in some way, shape, or form, because we might believe that God forgot about us. That's why bad things happened, or God wasn't with us, and that's why bad things happen. And that's where a lot of healing is really helpful, connecting with Jesus in those places to discover that we weren't alone. Someone was with us. Someone who loves us was with us, and he can actually help us process the pain. But those experiences leave a mark, and it shows up in how we understand and relate with God. And then there's missing skills in ourselves, missing relational skills in people around us. That when I'm missing skills, I'm not getting back to joy and peace, and I'm not interpreting things accurately, and I'm not finding God's perspective or his peace in those places. I'm not returning to joy. And so missing skills are actually a very common reason why we have a hard time seeing God as he is, and missing skills in other people. People who don't protect us from their emotions or their anger or their upsets, people who don't protect us from themselves. When we feel run over and we feel like roadkill with other people, that can impact how we view God. And then even other people's view of God can influence us and lead to distortions in how we view God. So, I had people in my life that didn't believe in God. And they had a very harsh reality for how they navigated the world. Or I had people who believed in God, but they had some really faulty beliefs about God. And so that influenced. I learned to see God from their perspective, which really wasn't helpful for me. I need to experience God myself to see God as he is through the lens of my awareness and my eyes and my ears and my heart. And then we have authority figures, which really play a role in how we interpret God. This could be pastors or leaders, Sunday school teachers, elders, coaches, anyone who has some influence over us in some way, anyone that we look to as an example or a model, as a representative of God. This can create a lot of damage. These may be people who've abused their power and done harm or caused abuse in some way, shape, or form. Whether we like it or not, at some level, these people can represent God or reflect God. And so when they do things that's harmful and not life-giving, we think, wow, if God's leaders are like that, then he must be a really bad God because look at his leaders, for goodness sakes. These people don't know what they're doing. They're causing a lot of pain. So we then see God from that perspective, which is not helpful. And as someone who's been serving God's people for 30 years, I've helped a lot of people who've had those unhelpful experiences with leaders or authority figures that caused harm. And keep in mind, there's two types of harm, two types of trauma. There's bad things that shouldn't happen, or there's painful absences. So neglect can be just as damaging, sometimes even more so than bad things that happen. So sometimes it's just we didn't get what we needed from these individuals, or we got something we didn't need. And then there are other church folk, other Christians, Christ followers, who influence us through their presence or their teaching or their life in some way. And they can leave a negative mark, a negative impression. And how we see God can be through this lens of like, well, Christians are just hurtful, rude, judgmental people. Why would I want to follow God when I see how his children are behaving? This causes us pain and distress in some way, and that can become very toxic. And I can remember one of my big struggles with God when I felt like God was calling me back to him and to go into ministry. I said, God, I think I really like you, but if following you means I have to be like your people, I don't know how to reconcile that. Like I had some wounds from fellow believers. And the response I felt the Lord gave me in that wrestling match was, well, Chris, I'm not asking you to be like them. I'm asking you to be like me. Follow me. And something shifted in my brain, like, oh, my job is to emulate Jesus and to follow Jesus. Now, ideally, all of his children would be a beautiful reflection of God's tapestry in this world. But we don't always find that those examples are very helpful. So these are just a few things and few factors that might go into how we view God. There's probably even more as you stop to think about it. So going back to your own life and the lens you have for seeing, understanding, and relating to God, what sorts of things have influenced the lens that you use to view God and his word and his character? The brain is designed to learn from modeling and examples and interactions. So, how well we learn to manage what we feel and recover when things go wrong will heavily influence our view of God. And in an ideal world, families and communities are meant to be beautiful reflections of God's heart, God's love, God's goodness, and God's way of life. And we have an enemy that knows this. If you think about the temptation in the garden for Adam and Eve, first thing the enemy goes after is God's identity. Did God really say this? Oh no, he knows that if you eat this, you'll become like him. So God's keeping the good stuff from you, right? So the enemy is really good at causing distortions and damage, particularly when God's children don't reflect God in a life-giving way. So it's helpful to start thinking some of these things through and really identifying some of the distortions we have and asking God, what's the best evidence for this view or this opinion or this belief that I have about God? Lord, what do you want me to know about where this comes from? And friends, this is why working on relational skills with other people can update our mind, update our models, and really help us address maturity so that we have this lens for understanding maturity gaps, particularly in leaders and other people. That when maturity is missing, there's often going to be a cost, and it's going to inevitably show up in our relationships and our interactions with people. And of course, it's not helpful when God's leaders justify their behavior to try to get away with being toxic in some way, to evade accountability. These are all factors that relational skills could really help to close the gap on some of these things so that we better reflect the living God. And friends, this is why skill 13 is so important, learning to see what God sees. We learn to interact with God and we discover firsthand that Jesus is so much better than what we ever imagined. Don't let culture, don't let poor examples, don't let painful experiences define God. Discover for yourself who God is through his Son, Jesus Christ. He's more loving and good and kind than we could ever imagine. And that's good news, my friends. So if you'd like to learn more about this journey of growing in your Godsight, living an Emmanuel lifestyle, if you go to thrivetoday.org, we have a skill 13 or the 19th skill page. We have skill 13, which is Godsight. And we have a whole habit builder class course devoted to Godsight, learning to see some of what God sees. This is a great resource. And at Skill 13 on the website, you can find a lot of good resources there. So, friends, I hope this is encouraging, and I hope that this is the start of something good for you today.